What Could Go Right? I'm Zachary Carabell, the founder of the Progress Network, joined as always by Emma Varvaloucas, the executive director of the Progress Network. And we are coming to you today for our weekly progress report, where we highlight some news of the week that you almost inevitably would have missed, that I would have missed, that Emma would have missed, that we all would have missed unless you made a concerted effort to find it. And finding good news in the very deep and full sea of negative news is a task. One has to seek out good news. Bad news just ineluctably comes to us in a regular metronomic tsunami. And that's part of the problem of the world we live in, is that we are inundated with negative news because news is, by almost definition, negative. But there's a lot going on in the world that is more constructive all the time, every day, everywhere, every place. And it is our belief at the Progress Network, it is our belief as individual Zachary and Emma and at all humans that paying attention to some of the good is necessary for our collective well-being. It is necessary for us to recognize where progress is being made in order to make progress, and it is necessary to identify things that are happening that are good in order to make sure that things good continue to happen. So that's what we're doing. We're coming to you from slightly different venues today. If you are watching the YouTube clips, I am in Joshua Tree, not necessarily on a vision quest, but not necessarily not on a vision quest. And Emma, as usual, is coming to us from Athens, Greece, not Athens, Georgia.
Actually not.
So, Emma.
I am not in Athens.
Oh my God,
actually.
I got it wrong.
Surprise, 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 surprise.
Are you in Amsterdam?
I'm in a port city called IJmuiden, which is near Amsterdam.
Okay.
Yes.
So there we go. We are both in not undisclosed locations because we have just disclosed them. We are in different locations, which may or may not provide a different lens on the world. I probably don't, but you never know.
I mean, we're in
How's the view up north?
cruise ship. It's the cruise ship capital of the Netherlands.
Wow.
Fun facts that
Who knew, man?
nobody cares about or knows.
You knew. So how's the view up north there, Emma?
It was hailing. It was hailing a few hours ago, but it's bright and sunny now. So we're doing all right.
It's a metaphor for the world as we
ready?
see it. Bad weather will give way to good weather.
That's right. And the Netherlands is a perfect place for that because the weather is constantly changing. Are we ready for our first piece of good news for the new podcast season?
Boom. That's my really inept drum roll. I will not quit my day job. I don't have a day job, so I can't really quit it. But whatever it is, I won't.
So it turns out all of your sea and tsunami and water-based metaphors were really apropos because we're going to talk about drowning.
Oh, oof.
Always need to talk about depressing topics to talk about the progress. Sorry, it's just part of the game here.
Okay.
So, good news coming out of the World Health Organization. They actually put preventing drowning under their purview for the first time 10 years ago. And we have the very first global report on the status of preventing drowning and whether or not the WHO has done anything in the last 20 years. So they measured it, for 20 years, but it's been under their purview for 10. And in fact, we have made progress. The death rate from drowning has gone down by 38% globally. Of course, that is different in different places, but that equates to about 75,000 people. So, a decent number.
Just out of curiosity, do we know how one actually takes measures to prevent drowning? I know in the United States and other countries, we have all the pool fence rules for kids. Other than that, I'm not sure, like, what does one do? You have lifeboats on mandatory on all boats. Are there things I am missing?
Yeah, so it depends on the country, right? Because some countries are kind of further behind on this than others. As you mentioned, in the States, we are not perfect per WHO recommendations about drowning prevention. Not every state has those laws about pools and so on, but that is one of them, fencing around private and public pool areas. But generally speaking, if you're just talking more about like globally, what helps teaching kids how to swim, because most of the people that drown are quite young, between 1 and 4, or quite old. So it's the elderly and the really young kids that tend to drown. Laws around life jackets, lifeboats, yes, but more like life jackets, and that you should be wearing them if you're on certain watercraft. Actually having daycare in some countries really helps because in places like Vietnam, people were like kind of leaving their young kids because they didn't have anyone to watch over them. And those kids would wander around and drown. So having daycare really helps. And weather alerts, because in the States, obviously, we have very advanced weather alerts. We know when, generally speaking, a storm is coming, a flood might occur. But if you live in a poorer country where you don't know that, you can get caught out in a severe weather disaster. So
Now
there you
that
go.
one I wouldn't have thought of, but that's interesting. The weather alert part.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So
Yeah.
it makes sense. It's, I mean, things you take for granted, right? Because we're so used to just opening up our iPhones and seeing the weather, or having, the news constantly tell you that a hurricane is coming. Doesn't happen in other parts of the world. So
Huh. There you go.
yeah, decent progress.
Okay.
And I will say
Decent
too
progress.
that the countries where the drowning rates were really high also made very particular progress. So places like Belarus, Laos, Bangladesh, they all dropped their rates by more than 2/3. So kudos to
Wow.
them.
All right. Next up.
Next up, I'm full of, as per usual, the most inspirational and not at all dispiriting topics. So after this, we're going to talk about rape kits. I know. I know. You're so happy you
Yeah.
tuned into this
Yeah.
podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But there
The rape
is, and
kit backlog. Are you going to tell us that the rape kit
yes,
backlog is finally being addressed?
we are exactly going to talk about the rape kit backlog. And that's exactly what I'm going to say. That, in fact, of course, exact numbers of how big the backlog is impossible to come by. But by some estimates, there were 300,000 or 400,000 backlog kits in the United States. Others say like 200,000. Anyway, the current count right now is a little over 71,000, which is dramatic. I mean, of course, that's
Wow.
still quite a backlog. I think it's something like 13 states that have cleared their backlog entirely. There are some cases where a state will clear their backlog and then it'll creep up again. But I mean, there has been really substantial progress on this issue, especially since 2016. And also, every single state, except for Maine, shame on you, Maine, has passed some kinds of rape kit reform law. So that's around funding for getting the backlog cleared, a victim's right to know the status of their kit, things of that nature. Every single state except for Maine. I don't know what's going on in Maine, but they are considering
I
some
don't know.
bills in this upcoming session.
And this builds on the work that a lot of people have been doing literally for 20 plus years. So Mariska Hargitay of Law and Order SVU fame has a charity called Joyful Heart, which for years was pounding the table about this rape kit backlog. You had these reforms right in the 80s and 90s where rape kits became a thing, and then they would just sit, right? Because there was no money, hence the backlog, to test them, or no political will to allocate the money is probably the accurate way of putting it. And so you just had this, women had gone through this ordeal, and then kind of the secondary ordeal, because reporting it and having the rape kit done is not exactly a fun experience either. And then they would just sit around. And it took really more than a decade of people saying, hey, wait a minute, this is ridiculous. You've allocated all this money to collection and presumably to create hard evidence of who a rapist was and then prosecute, and we're doing nothing to actually work through that backlog. So that's a major move that's happened. One of these things that sort of everything happened slowly till everything happened quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say too, something that I learned researching this issue is that it's not only just a justice issue for a victim, like that they're going to find the person that attacked them. It's also a public safety issue, because a lot of the people, when they find out, when they finally test these kits, a lot of these people are repeat offenders. So they could have been off the streets, like years prior, if the kit had gone through.
So that's good news about bad news.
Good news about bad news, our specialty here at the Progress Network. And we're going to end on one more good news about bad news. We are going to talk about Cambodia and landmines, because the end of February was National Mine Awareness Day, which probably people don't know, but it was on February 24th. And I wanted to talk about the progress that Cambodia has made, clearing the country of landmines and unexploded ordnances in the 90s. That's the result of a civil war that they had there in the 70s and 80s, for those that don't know. And they have gotten casualties down to like under 50 per year. And there used to be like thousands. There's over 4,000 in 1996 and 49 in 2024. They've cleared most of the country. I think it's like 80 or 90%. They are facing some challenges about kind of getting the very last bit done, particularly because there's some land with the border of Thailand that they're having trouble delineating who's allowed to do that stuff there. And they are, I should say, caveat behind schedule. They had the goal of clearing the entire country by 2025, and they announced recently that they're not going to make that. They're going to push it to 2030. But still, they have done an incredible amount of work clearing the vast majority of the country of these landmines and unexploded ordinances. So I think they deserve some claps as well.
Absolutely. And it's true. If anybody who's gone to Laos or Cambodia or Vietnam and you see these signs, just either don't go in this area, or there have been various nonprofits as well as UN, as well as US sponsored to some degree. We were until recently. I think some of these programs have been actually cut and we're under USAID, although I have to look into that. But we were funding the clearing of the mines that we laid, particularly in Laos. And we didn't lay mines in Laos. We bombed Laos. We laid a lot of mines in Vietnam. And, you know, even 25 years, as you just mentioned, after these conflicts ended, there were people dying from stepping on unexploded mines. This was also somewhat an issue after World War II in Belgium and elsewhere. And it's going to be a huge issue in eastern Ukraine. So even if there's this ceasefire or whatever happens between Russia and Ukraine, there's just an entire several 100-mile swath of eastern Ukraine that is saturated with mines, all of which are lethal and often kill kids because they're the ones playing in the fields, kids and farmers. And so you had this year after year after year, 25 years after the Vietnam War ended, you still had, as you said, hundreds of people or thousands of people dying in Cambodia or dying in Vietnam. And it's just astonishing when you think about it, that the kind of the long-term effects of ... Because of course we always think the war's done, right? It's done. We're done. We can just go back to our lives, which may be true in large measure, but clearly not true if your field is full of mines. So it's just one of these aspects of modern warfare in particular that I suppose gets no attention. And then the clearing of it is thankless work, but absolutely vital and necessary. So good to know that it's finally being done.
Yeah. I mean, one bit about the US funding is that this information that I was just sharing came from a Cambodian news source, and it does particularly thank the US funding for allowing some of this stuff to occur. Of course, we don't know if this funding is going to continue. Secretary of State Marco Rubio just announced that they've cut 83% of USAID's programs, but we don't know which ones. So
Right.
likely it doesn't continue, but who knows? We'll see. And I wanted to add as well, what I learned recently from looking into this is that it wasn't just people who were fighting in the war that laid mines. It was also people trying to protect areas, like trying to protect temples and things like that. They would circle the temple with mines. So it's
Oh, wow.
really, yeah, it really goes quite deep. And of course, there's no records about where these mines were placed. So it's also like you don't have any idea where they are.
Wow.
So yeah, quite the
That's intense.
challenge getting rid of them. Yeah.
Okay, so this week we had a slightly different take on our good news stories, as in it was the good news about the bad news. But part of the point we're making in all this is, much of human history is humans solving problems that humans created, and this is one iteration of it. So, to be fair, often good news is in fact the amelioration of prior bad news or prior bad human behavior or destructive human behavior. We kind of innovate. Sometimes we innovate our way out of a problem. Sometimes we just clean up a problem that we've created. But there is a dialectic that goes on there where we create a lot of bad things and then we try to do a lot of good things to solve the bad things. And that is kind of the way society moves. Maybe unfortunately, like it would certainly be better to have not done the things in the first place, but that requires a completely different human race than the one that currently exists. So there we have it. We have progress in the face of bad stuff people have done. I guess drowning is not bad stuff people have done. Drowning is just things that humans
It's
do
a
when
fact
they...
of life, right? Yeah. I
Right.
mean,
So that
yeah.
one's a little different. That's us dealing with just what does it mean to be alive on a planet where there are risks, but even so. So we will be back with you with our longer form interview, also called What Could Go Right, that you can tell on whatever media platform you're on, or iPod, or I guess no one's on an iPod anymore. I kind of meant to say your podcast platform. Uh,
It's a good
yeah.
throwback, though.
So that was just, yeah. I mean, that's where podcasts came from. So at least there's some connection to the original idea. So whatever platform you're on, if it's a shorter episode, it's the progress report. If it's a longer episode, it's the What Could Go Right interview one. If that's not clearly flagged, so we will be back with you with our longer interview. We will be back next week with our next progress report. We want to thank you for listening as always. And We have one ask, which is if you come across interesting, constructive stories, please share them with us. There's an email address at theprogressnetwork.org, and you can send it along, and maybe we will highlight it and credit you accordingly, as you should be. So please do that, and thank you for listening, and thank you, Emma, for scouring and finding.
Thank you, Zachary, for hosting, as always, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in.